Wy'am, Celilo Falls. What makes something an architectural site? What makes something architectural history? Celilo Falls was once a waterfall that existed on the Columbia River near the modern town of the Dalles, Oregon, near the confluence of where the Deschutes enters the Columbia River. This site, now marked as Celilo Village, was once the site of a waterfall that during spring melt would pump more water over its shores than would go over Niagara Falls by 5 to 15 times as much. This site was the center trading point and the central cultural point for dozens of indigenous nations and people. Ideas, thoughts, art, everything was traded and shared here. Those people in question are referred to by many different names, many different nations. Largely, they were people who spoke the Safatian language family, as well as also known as the Plateau First Nations people between to the east of the Cascade Mountains and to the west of the Rocky Mountains. One of their other names was Wy'am, which roughly translates to the salmon people. So we know that there was this waterfall. We know who has relationships to that waterfall. So how did this waterfall come to be? And we have to go back in history to the retreat of the Cordilleran ice sheet some 30,000 years ago and the creation of Glacial Lake Missoula. Every once in a while, as Glacial Lake Missoula would continue to grow, it would break its ice dam, thus flooding the valleys. And this would happen every couple hundred years. And it shaped the Columbia River and eastern Washington, eastern Oregon, northern Idaho, and western Montana, creating unique landscapes not seen through much of the rest of the world. These floods stopped about 15,000 years ago. And with that, the waterfall began to form, and people began living there as early as 9,000 BC, roughly. 9,300 BC to 8,200 BC. And by about 7,000 BC, it was pretty understood that people were living and fishing around this site. Celilo Falls as a site has been continuously lived and fished at for anywhere from 7 to 10,000 years. And as we move on, as we look towards what the site is and who is it for, it starts with salmon, and specifically Chinook salmon. Here we see Chinook salmon being roasted in a traditional way over an open pit fire, as well as dried salmon being eaten in a traditional way known as chulai, paste of dry salmon done in the 1950s. Here we see a modern fishing ceremony and salmon ceremony being conducted in the rebuilt and modern Celilo Longhouse in the Celilo Village. So as we look at, we know there was this waterfall. We know that salmon plays this central role in understanding the people and what makes this waterfall so important. And we now have to look at the structures that make the site so interesting and important. And the first kind of relate to the fishing ceremony. And it tethers back to what we just discussed in the relationship of the spirituality and the cultural identity of salmon being more than food, it being a cultural touchstone that defined the people who lived here, along with many others along the northwest coast and up to Alaska and even over to parts of northern Japan and other parts of the northern Pacific. Salmon has an interesting role. And here we see these spaces that kind of mark the first of these architectural elements. Though they weren't permanent architectural elements, you won't see remnants of these wood stands that allowed people to do dip net fishing with their fishing nets would jut out along the just natural curves and rock formations along this waterfall and allow people to fish for salmon. This fishing ceremony almost functioned as a point of liminality for many people. And though it was a site that primarily was exclusive to men in these societies, it functioned as a point where you would not be allowed on there as a kid. But once you could fish the site, you were considered a man. It was the point where childhood transitioned into an adulthood, in a way. And as we look at these, there isn't a uniform style or a uniform identity. There's just a cultural understanding of how these should be built and what trolleys should be used and how things should be existing within the site. And that comes through an oral tradition, orally passing on these traditions and cultural touchstones, and how do people exist and live on these sites. An interesting aspect of this site, unlike a lot of other Neolithic sites, its history isn't necessarily ancient. And with that, we can kind of see, as of the 30s, there were these videos taken of the site showing the streams of running water. And though this video highlights many different stereotypes, as much of how white Americans viewed indigenous people through much of our history. But we can see people using spears and dip nets to fish along Celilo Falls and use planks that look very similar to the ones seen in the photos and ones seen even further back. This recording is interesting. That sound is believed to be the only sound of the majestic thundering of the water. So as we move past these fishing platforms and we move past the tools used to fish, we look at two other forms of architecture that fall into this architecture style of impermanence. They're not permanent structures that will remain there and show the dregs or show the remnants of their society long after they're done being used, but one being the longhouses, otherwise known as Cutnam, made of woven mats and meant to house large scales of the society and the structures of leadership and cultural meetings and these fishing ceremonies. Everything would be centered around these structures. The other one being teepees or tsetskui. These are structural systems that many understand and know, but what they effectively are wooden poles tethered together, wrapped in a woven animal skin, to provide semi-mobile living situation and a living space for people. And so we've gone over some of these architectural structures, and what becomes clear is this site isn't necessarily about these architectural structures. It's about the people's relationship with salmon and the architecture of the site itself and the geography of the site itself and what makes it so interesting. But like so many other sites, we have to move towards what happens next. And that comes into treaties and broken promises. From the middle of the 19th century to the 20th century, there is a litany of different treaties and court cases that take and give and deeply impact how people live and exist and can interact with the site. To this day, indigenous people in the Northwest hold large swaths of fishing rights because of what was taken and how recently it was taken. But at the same point, as much as people were re-given rights to fish on their fish grounds, that was quickly taken away by the late 1950s, we see these videos and we see all these things that show this date of the early 50s, mid 50s, and part of that is because by the late 1950s, the Dalles Lock and Dam finished construction, and with its construction, it flooded Celilo Falls. It covered it underwater, and it meant that it would not be able to exist in any functional way because it was underwater now, under the flooded lakes of a dam that provided power to Portland and other cities in Oregon, as well as cities in California. And with that, in many ways, it's emblematic of what has happened to a lot of indigenous people. Beyond just genocide of the actual people who have lived here, it's a cultural genocide and alienating and annihilating people's access to their cultures and their cultural touchstones. But like so many other things, like the salmon, like the people, there's resilience and they still exist. Celilo Falls still exists, or at least the rock formations that once made it. The day when the Dalles Dam comes down, Celilo Falls will reform. Its rock formations still exist. And so the question is this is an architectural site. It's not a question, this is an architectural site, but it doesn't function in the same way of there are stone structures, there are architectural plans. It follows an oral tradition and a tradition of impermanence and temporary architecture that existed with the land, much like in harmony with the fish. It was never one of dominating the nature. It was in harmony with nature, in congruence with nature, to live as a part of it. And here are some of the sources that were used through this. Thank you.